Welcome everyone, I'm Lisa Schwartz with Berkeley Lab. We'll be covering our new report for the Future Electric Utility Regulation Series, the role of innovation in the electric utility sector. Let's go to slide 3. The report and slides are posted on our website. We'll put the link in the chat box, and we're recording this presentation. We'll make the recording available at that same link. Because we have a lot of people on the webinar, everyone's in listen mode only. So please use the Q&A box to send your questions and comments anytime during the webinar. And following the presentations, I'll moderate Q&A. Next slide, please. So the Future Electric Utility Regulation Series taps leading thinkers to provide multiple perspectives. And these are tough regulatory issues for the electricity sector. Our goal is to inform ongoing discussion and debate. The U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Modernization Lab Consortium supports this work, and all of our reports, as well as presentations and webinar recordings, are posted on our Berkeley Lab website. I also want to thank our Future Electric Utility Regulation Advisory Group for their assistance with the report series. Next slide, please. Our advisory group includes utility regulators, utilities, consumer advocates, environmental and social justice organizations, regional grid operators, and other experts. Next slide. At this point, we've published 13 reports in the series. We also have 3 additional publications funded through this project. And again, you can get all of those reports at our website. Next slide. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce the report, and I want to provide a little context, and then we'll hear consumer, labor, third-party provider, and clean technology consultant perspectives on electric sector innovation, all in the context of state regulation of utilities. So our contributors are the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. It's an association of 59 utility consumer advocates in 44 states, as well as the District of Columbia, Barbados, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. NASUCA members are designated by the laws of their jurisdictions to represent the interests of utility consumers before state and federal regulators and in the courts. We also have the BlueGreen Alliance, which unites labor unions and environmental organizations to solve today's environmental challenges in ways that create and maintain quality jobs and build a clean, thriving, and equitable economy. The Institute for Electric Innovation, which focuses on advancing the adoption and application of new technologies that will strengthen and transform the power grid. Its members are the investor-owned electric utilities that represent about 70% of the US electric power industry. Sunrun, which is the largest residential solar and battery storage company in the United States. And finally, Build Edison, which offers advisory and consulting services and solutions to enable startups to transition their technologies to commercial growth and benefit both customers and inventors. NASUCA wrote its essay with assistance from Tim Wolf and Ben Havamaki of Synapse Energy Economics, and other report authors are Kevin Lee for the BlueGreen Alliance, Adam Cooper, Lisa Wood, and Mike Schuster for the Institute for Electric Innovation, and Hoskins, and Christopher Worley for Sunrun, and Kristen Barbado, Barbara Cates Garnick, and Max McCafferty for Build Edison. Next slide, please. So in the United States, energy utilities on average invest a pretty low percent of net revenues in R&D, research and development, compared to similarly situated industries. Compared to other countries, expenditures in the US on electricity system R&D is significantly less than leading economies when you normalize to the gross domestic product, as we can see in the graph. So US electric company innovations tend to be reactive to initiatives by regulators and their corporate customers. And also state regulators and consumer advocates can be wary of R&D spending recovered in retail rates. But it's important because utility regulatory advances can speed innovation in the electric sector. So some public utility commissions are exploring new approaches to spur innovation. For utilities, that means regulatory and marketing flexibility, could mean increased funding for demonstrations, and in some states, performance-based rate making, including multi-year rate plans. And for third-party providers, it can mean ways to provide utility customers with innovative products and services directly. Next slide, please. Today, we have 5 presenters to talk about this topic. First is Tim Tessier, a utility specialist in the Iowa Office of Consumer Advocate. Next is Chris Markuson, the Western States Director for BlueGreen Alliance. And then we'll hear from Adam Cooper, a Senior Director of Research and Strategy at Institute for Electric Innovation. Next slide, please. After that, we'll hear from Ann Hoskins, Chief Policy Officer at Sunrun. And our final presenter is Max McCafferty with Build Edison. Following their presentations, I'll moderate Q&A with the audience. And at that time, Shannon Beal, a consumer representative from Massachusetts, also will join us. So please type your questions as we go along in the Q&A box at any time. I'll grab them and I will moderate Q&A following everyone's presentations. Next slide, please. Tim, would you please kick off our presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, Tim Tessier here from the Iowa Office of Consumer Advocate, and happy to kick off the conversation here today. So, as we're seeing major developments affecting the electricity grid that will continue to drive transformation, how do we continue to protect consumers going forward in this nonstop and at times rapid transformation of the electricity grid? And that's what NASUCA tried to do with this paper, is ask its members about the expectations of how the electricity sector will change over the next 10 to 20 years. And that included views on potential benefits, innovation, prospective challenges, and just how these developments will impact the role of consumer advocates in the electricity sector. And while we'd like to present solutions to all of these, it's more of a thought piece here of showing the potential upsides and downsides of selected innovations and just helping people, and that's consumer advocates, regulators, even utilities, all stakeholders, the opportunities and challenges associated with innovations that we're going to be seeing in the electricity sector. Next slide, please. So overall, changes in technology and policy, as we all know, operate basically symbiotically, is that grid advances drive changes in policy, and the grid evolves with these new policies. So they kind of operate together. And as you can see on the slide here, there's expansions expected in the technologies and on the grid. And all of those are working with and also driven by the new policies. And as legislators are looking at all these new areas, currently are, but there'll be new areas they'll be looking at even further that we don't know yet, or can't quite see that will be a driving factor. But all we do know is that there's a lot of change coming. Some of it can be anticipated. Others will be looking to have to, adopt into our future plans as we go along. Next slide, please. So how the electric utility of the future will look. In the face of all this technological and policy trends and all the changes, the utilities will continue to evolve in different ways and different paces over the next 20 years. And that's kind of the views we got from our members throughout the country. The pace and change that we expect in every state is going to be different. But we do know, the focus of utilities will still be the same, as that they're maximizing profits, but the way they have to do that and they can generate revenues is going to be changed and not remain static. And that's where the input we got from our members, we tried to group into these 4 major categories you're seeing here on the screen. And all of these come with a very common theme. I've already said it, and I'll say it many times, is change. The first one here, changes in the way customers consume electricity. New technologies will be adopted by customers that will change how they either consume electricity by plugging in more like an electric vehicle or other devices, or actually, supplement their electricity consumption by deploying distributed energy resources or solar. And this will then cause change in the way utilities have to price electricity. Customers are going to want different ways to price their usage to be more reflective of their consumption patterns. And this will be very challenging for utilities because, as that last bullet, cost allocation will be a very key issue to make sure that those that are causing the cost are paying, and benefits they're achieving aren't being paid by somebody that isn't achieving benefits. And this will result in changing the way utilities construct and have to operate their grids. Planning will be very key, and I'll touch on that later also. But with all the different integrations of new technology, like highlighted here, non-wires alternatives or new parties like third-party providers, the utilities now will have to balance a lot more than they ever had on the different levels: generation, transmission, distribution, but more importantly on the grid in general, as more players and more electricity is out there. And ultimately, this will result in changes in the market and market structure. New participants, new load, new revenue streams all have to be balanced like never before. Next slide, please. So with all this change, as the electricity industry becomes increasingly complex, demands on consumer advocates will also increase dramatically. And that third bullet under consumer representation is very key and should be highlighted here, is that consumer advocates are going to be expected to cover a lot more forums, and we already do. I mean, it's no longer just at the state level, it's also at the regional level and even at the federal level. But it'll even go into, as it says here, the courts with court challenges or even legislation that would be needed going forward. So very challenging times ahead for consumer advocates. I mean, looking at cost shifting, consumer advocates will have to pay more attention to this to properly define benefits and ensure customers who receive the benefits, again, are paying the commensurate share of costs, and those that are not hurt by this. And that also then creates risk, and risk shifting is, you know, the current regulatory practices are going to have to adapt to how they handle the changes, specifically as highlighted here on stranded assets. The way we handle stranded assets now may not fit going forward as utilities adopt and deploy new technologies, but also retire and move past technologies in the past and make sure that stranded assets, you know, are not unduly paid by those that may not receive the benefits. A theme you'll hear me say quite a bit. But all this boils down to is trying to find the best solution to continue to advocate for and protect consumers as we move further away from how things are today. Next slide, please. So the next couple slides are kind of the meat of the paper and highlight the main key areas of innovations that we see going forward in the future and what we got as input from our advocates. And while the consumer advocates don't expect a complete redesign of electric utility regulation in the industry over the next 20 years, there are, you know, these trends that you'll see on the next two slides. There'll be a greater emphasis. And with that, as we highlight on the next two slides of the opportunities, I also want to highlight the challenges that'll come with that. And I mean, with innovation, there's so many positives that go with it, but we all need to take a step back and realize that we need to look at these very carefully to ensure that along with those opportunities, the challenges are also dealt with at the same time. So we're not creating a worse situation or less benefits going forward when we go to deploy and adopt these technologies. Walking through these, the first one, distributed energy resources. These, again, as kind of talked about, consumers will be deploying more measures on their own, which is a very positive thing. But then the challenges that come with that is that that's not going to be everybody that can do that. Not everybody will want to, or not all parties can. So again, net benefits need to flow to everybody and not just putting costs on everybody when they are not the cost causers of that. And that goes right into the cost allocation. It's going to be very challenging going forward with the adoption of new technologies and innovations and new pricing. All of these things are new challenges that regulators and consumer advocates haven't had to deal with as they will be going forward. So very challenging, very tough for everybody to be on top of these new technologies and work together to develop them properly to assure that benefits are being experienced by all parties. And again, that cost is allocated efficiently. Next one, PBR. I know PBR stands for many things, but here it's performance-based rate making, which is alternative regulatory mechanism to provide clear financial incentives for utilities to help manage and hopefully reduce costs. And this will be great opportunities again, because it'll hopefully expand the time between rate cases, which creates rate stability, which is a good thing. But with that, the challenge there is looking at new multi-year rate plans and new offerings like that, this is something new that regulators and consumer advocates may not have ever seen before. So again, it's have to design these properly and take the time to truly understand, you know, the opportunities and challenges that even come with those to ensure that what we move forward with is the best possible solution, or what's the best way to adopt or to adapt to that as we go forward. So it increases the regulatory burden on regulators and consumer advocates to help ensure that we're getting it right. And then down the last one, enhanced integrity planning. I mean, better integration, planning, coordination as things change. All those things present great opportunities, but also great challenges because, again, it's very diverse, it's complex, it's new. We don't know really what to expect with all these new technologies and how that will impact everybody. So again, a regulatory challenge, and also learning and understanding to be able to work with the stakeholders to develop the right way to handle this and to plan going forward. So again, it's transparency of information that's going to be key from all parties going forward, so that we're making the best solutions on best and complete information. Next slide, please. And the final three here, improved treatment of stranded costs. I've mentioned stranded costs a few times. There will be opportunities for utilities to try to manage this. Pre-review, the second bullet there, pre-review of major utility investments. It's advanced rate making without a rate case can be very helpful to give assurances to utilities. But again, it increases the regulatory burden on regulators and consumer advocates to make sure that, again, that's the right decision going forward, that it doesn't create new challenges or new problems. And sometimes handling of stranded costs may even have a little bit of a delay. It could, like securitization, require legislation prior to deployment. So it's a timing issue that if it's something that needs to be deployed, we need to be planning ahead. More attention to energy equity. I mean, I've mentioned many times about cost causation and benefits. So a lot of new opportunities for people to have more benefits and to reduce their own costs, but we have to make sure then it's not a burden on other people picking up the cost, that the costs need to be equitable to all parties, especially those that may not have the ability to necessarily deploy all the new resources. And then finally, policies address climate change. It's already been kind of highlighted that, you know, there will be more policies, legislations, and even environmental requirements, decarbonization, resilience, storm hardening, and even talks, like I said, carbon capture and emissions. It's an interesting topic that's coming up again. But ultimately, we need to ensure that how utilities adapt and deploy these climate policy requirements doesn't unduly burden the consumers. As increases demand on the electricity grid, it could also cause increased electricity costs. So, you know, how do we handle that going forward? Continue to adapt and just make sure that we are setting the basis for everybody to benefit without additional costs. Next slide, please. So just kind of to wrap up before I hand it off to Chris here, you know, as all of us stakeholders, you know, consumer advocates, utility regulators, utilities continue to work together, you know, this is going to be a great opportunity to create the electricity environment that we're going to have in the future. But, you know, we need to encourage and respond to these innovations with being mindful of the opportunities and challenges that kind of highlighted here, but ones that we haven't even thought of yet. But everyone will still need to stay focused on ensuring that new policies and regulatory practices are well designed and strike the right balance between allowing the industry to evolve in productive directions while achieving current and new policy goals, but ultimately ensuring consumer protection and equity remain a key priority. Thank you very much.
Tim.
Look forward to the Q&A.
Next up, we have Chris Markuson with BlueGreen Alliance. Chris?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the Berkeley Lab for having me here today. It's exciting to be here. Shifting from centralized fossil energy resources to distributed energy resources carries impacts across the socio-political spectrum. The section of this paper I'll discuss today describes the opportunity at our fingertips, a risk that's being underestimated, and labor policy strategies to address that risk. Next slide, please. First, the opportunity. Achieving net zero for the power sector by 2050 is an incredible economic development opportunity for local communities. This graphic is from Princeton's Net Zero America report. It shows new wind and solar construction needed to realize a carbon neutral power sector by 2050. They model roughly equal amounts of wind and solar here. As you can see, there's a lot to build. We quantify the amount of development in a highly technical way, gobs and gobs. One report estimates the US will need to build over 75 gigawatts of generation capacity every year. And as this graphic illustrates, much of that generation will be far from existing load, requiring matching transmission infrastructure. One study identifies that the transmission network must triple in size by 2050. Multiple sources also note the need for accompanying non-intermittent clean energy resources, including long-range storage, fossil fuel generation with carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen-fired power plants, as well as geothermal and nuclear. Consumer polling shows that Americans support clean energy policy. However, when clean energy policy materializes as massive amounts of wind or solar infrastructure in their communities, and if it comes with a net reduction of high quality jobs, that support quickly fades. Next slide, please. To the risk we observe, failing to account for and achieve community outcomes may be potentially catastrophic to achieving net zero goals. As the previous slide demonstrated, in order to achieve the amount of renewables development necessary to meet clean energy goals, a massive amount of local support must be fostered. Getting this support can be challenging. We all recognize some of the things that make communities hesitant to revise local codes and authorize clean energy development. They may encompass a wide range, including concerns about potential noise, solar glare, viewshed protection, wildlife and livestock impacts, access to public lands, and even wind tower blinky light impacts to dark skies. These issues can be addressed through careful planning and siting. However, we see one thing being overlooked that cannot be solved through local land use planning. Opposition to clean energy projects is growing because today, clean energy comes with net permanent job losses, eliminating the jobs of workers in fossil energy production that offer family-sustaining wages and benefits. In fact, across 36 states, we observe growing local restrictions and mobilization of opposition to renewable generation, transmission, and distribution project development. We believe we can and must design policies that ensure clean energy development carries benefits to communities, including creation of permanent, local, high-quality jobs and lasting tax benefits, particularly in distressed communities. Gaining the level of local support necessary requires policies to ensure truly local, lasting benefits will accompany clean energy development. Next slide, please. As fossil fuel generation facilities are retired, job losses occur. This graphic is from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. It shows the 30% overall loss of jobs that has accompanied coal plant retirements since the 1990s. Additionally, utility business models have reduced full-time line workers while expanding utilization of contract labor, often leveraging non-local contractors. Not only does this infuse socio-political risk, it also makes utilities less able to respond to weather emergencies and potentially prolonging disruptive power outages. Next slide, please. So our solution, we think this opportunity will be realized only as a result of intentional regulatory and legislative policymaking that ties community outcomes to clean energy projects. We conclude our findings with some best practices we observe happening and policy strategies that can help turn local opposition into support. We recognize policy improvements are needed on two primary fronts, through legislation and through regulatory frameworks. Public Utility Commission review of customer service metrics, staffing, wage and benefit standards, and full transparency of utility labor practices and regulatory matters are important regulatory structures that we recommend. Similarly, state legislatures are starting to expand PUC authority to evaluate economic and workforce impacts in resource planning processes. We also see lawmakers beginning to require targeted hiring provisions, prevailing wage requirements, and construction contracts that steer benefits to impacted and disadvantaged people through project labor agreements or community benefit agreements. And so we surmise that these practices and policies are essential to meeting our power sector climate goals and making sure that the benefits are realized within communities primarily. With that, I'll pause and look forward to questions. Back to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. Next up, we have Adam Cooper with the Institute for Electric Innovation, representing the investor-owned electric utilities. Adam?
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to submit the essay. I just want to thank my colleagues, Lisa Wood and Mike Schuster, the other co-essayists. The next slide, please. The 10 technology partners on IEI's roundtable and the electric companies. So on the slide, a little bit more about IEI. Our sort of DNA is sharing good ideas that really help drive outcomes that benefit customers, that benefit the grid, and that bring along emissions or environmental benefits. We're seeing a technology foundation that's been built over the past decade that's really changing what electric companies and customers can do and want to do. From the smart meter investments over the past decade on the utility side, along with smart grid investments, and also what the customers are bringing sort of to the table. We're seeing these sort of partnerships forming between technology company and electric company to really change the offerings, the services and solutions that utilities deliver to residential customers along with corporate customers. Next slide, please. So in our essay, we just wanted to take the opportunity to kind of highlight a couple of great programs and trends that we're seeing over the past couple of years that advance energy management and clean energy goals, that make use of that technology investment to really personalize some services that customers are expecting. We live in a as a service sort of subscription world now, and customers expect new offerings from every provider of a service, including their electric companies. We're seeing greater interest and need for time-varying rates. And again, this is the technology's been there for a while, but the cause or reason may not have yet existed until now. And what I'm speaking about is, there's a greater sort of need for some peak shifting, some load shaping, and using low carbon energy when it's available. And these new time varying rates really send a price signal and a motivation for customer response. And also the generation profile is becoming a little bit more variable as more clean energy is brought online that is variable by nature. We're seeing a little bit of a transition to a clean energy sector that places a greater role on the customer and their actions. We're also, from my purview, I've been looking at a lot of net zero energy or net zero emission studies, and every one of them places a greater role on customer participation. On the utility side, we're also seeing a bit of an expansion of these offerings to engage the customer, to help them with some certainty and clarity about different rate options that they have, what their bill may be, how they can pay. On the corporate customer side, we list a couple of what I feel is really innovative programs that help the corporate customers who want a greater amount of carbon-free energy than what is inherent on the grid get it and subscribe to it. The large corporates are really leading and accelerating this transition to a carbon-free future, and they're helping to drive down the costs of making these investments. We're seeing some interesting sort of flexible resources coming on board through storage, where in some cases, and I'll drill into this a bit further in these examples, that resource is used for the subscribing corporate customer, but then it's also used to address system and grid needs. Next slide, please. So a few of the examples, and really what we think of are really innovative solutions for residential customers, is sort of a mobile-first app experience that DTE has been providing to their customers for about 5+ years now. It helps the customer sort of dig into their bill, manage their budgets. If a new rate is offered by DTE and they subscribe to it, or they are enrolled into it, that app helps them sort of understand the new rates and how their current energy use patterns, how that would be the cost of that, or if they were to, let's say, add a new end use device like an electric vehicle, what that would mean in terms of the new rates. They can also drill into what's the end cause of the consumption. Maybe get some diagnostic help there in terms of something may be running more than it should, or having sort of a driver on the bill, and then address that. A couple 100,000 households have downloaded this app by DTE, and those who engage save energy, and they also they benefit from that, and the system itself benefits from that energy reduction. The APS example, we chose that because it sort of does a few things. One, it says, help customers get the energy management technology in a very easy way through a marketplace. When they subscribe to a program, given the technology plus have it be set up so that it's ready for the program. So this is through a pre-enrollment function for a smart thermostat program. Once they receive the smart thermostat, it's already sort of set up for program participation. Within APS, they have time-varying rates, so there's already a sort of underlying rate incentive for this management of the smart thermostats, and that pre-enrollment function has really helped drive participation in a program by a couple 100%, where if you don't pre-enroll, it's a little bit more difficult for the customers to engage. The resource that the APS has built, this customer-side resource, is now able to reliably provide 40 megawatts of flexible load. And I'm certain these numbers are a little dated. This is from last year. So what we're seeing is both a customer resource, a system resource, and also that load is flexible so that it can align to both system conditions in terms of if there's a capacity issue, but also maybe align to when clean energy is available on the grid, and to pre-cool homes prior to really a hot point of the day, but when solar is a little bit more abundant a little earlier. The Georgia Power example just walks through a couple of different billing and rate options. Georgia Power has been doing a fantastic job of sort of giving customers some choices in rate and billing options, some certainty within those rate options, and they've seen just a natural migration of customers opting for what we would call non-standard rates. So about half their customers are on something other than a rate that's just a fixed charge with variable consumption. This is really aligning to where we think customers are going with their expectation and being able to better manage their use, being able to have some certainty around their bill. And we think that this is the future for many electric companies. Next slide, please. The Portland General Electric peak time rebate program, that's this is sort of an example of using data science to really drill into those top performing customers and really do some targeted marketing so that they are enrolled in a program so that they respond to when there's a system peak. we're seeing a lot of really exciting applications of data science to better target certain customers who have a proclivity to be more engaged in a utility offering, to maybe provide a greater value as a participant. And what we see there is some personalization is really helping both the customer and the utility find a mutual benefit. The last example that we have on the residential customer side is the PG&E's opt-out TOU rate plan, and they're really leaning in on digital communications, tools, again coaching customers around what does it mean to be on these new rates, and what would happen if you make a major energy purchase. What we're seeing on the customer side writ large is a menu of options is really what customers expect. It can be designed to deliver a multitude of system benefits, of customer benefits, and of environmental benefits. And it also helps address some equity interests. All of these programs can be fine-tuned to different types or sets of customers. So if you think about the residential set and you want to maybe get a little bit more fine-tooth with the delivery of an offering to a low to moderate income customer, that's something that is happening, and the application of data science and the application of these energy management tools through the utility offering is really providing a broad base of benefits. Let's move to the next slide and dive a little bit more into what's happening on the large customer side. So I mentioned that the large customers have pretty ambitious goals around sustainability, around carbon-free energy, and just wanted to kind of share a couple of examples of how electric companies are addressing these interests. SCE, Southern California Edison, established clean energy optimization pilots with a handful of universities in California, and this was a first of its kind performance-based GHG reduction program. So it's really an incentive for the universities to manage their energy use, but more so manage their carbon and reduce it. SCE works with the universities. There's many different ways that the university can address greenhouse gas and reduce it. And so it's, again, this menu of options idea that is really helping address, in this case, the GHG goals of the universities and of the state of California. The NV Energy example with Google is, I think, really fascinating and really the future for a lot of these large subscription services with electric companies and large customers. It's packaging, a large array of solar with a flexible battery storage resource. And there's a sharing arrangement of that storage resource so that during this summer peak hours, the battery's dispatched to the benefit of all customers, and otherwise it's really dispatched to manage or feed into the Google data center and ensure that Google is operating on a 24/7 carbon-free energy footprint every hour of the day. So these are just a couple of examples of where we're seeing great applications of technology paired with customer expectations and obviously approval by regulators. Next slide, please. So in short, a menu of options is what customers are expecting. Technology is helping electric companies deliver the solutions, and happy to take questions at the end. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Adam. And next up, we have Ann Hoskins with Sunrun.
Thanks, Lisa. Hello, everybody. A real pleasure to be here. I want to start by thanking Chris Worley and Kylie Horton, who worked with me, along with some current and former Sunrunners who helped put this together. Next slide, please. So I am talking to you from hotel room in New York, which is a little dingy. But when I flew here from California yesterday, it was a long flight, and I had the opportunity to read all of the papers. And so I just want to start by encouraging all of you to do that. We're having these conversations here, but it's interesting that I think the common theme is that, we all know that innovation is necessary. We all have some different ideas on how to get there. So I look forward to the Q&A, and I'm going to go quickly through these slides so we can get to that. As Lisa said, I'm with Sunrun. We are the largest distributed solar and battery, and now hopefully electrification company in the country on the competitive side. And I've been here almost 6 years. Before that, I was a regulator in the Maryland Commission. And before that, I was actually at Public Service Enterprise Group. So I like to say that I've seen these issues from many perspectives. And one thing is for sure, and that is that our electric grid is just overstressed. It's certainly not up to supporting the urgent need for widespread electrification. Extreme weather events are repeatedly, exposing the fragility of this grid. Having lived now in California for almost 6 years, I've certainly felt that personally with the wildfires and the outages. And many utilities are not delivering on the resilience and reliability that I know are core to their missions, again, having been at one, and they're just not moving fast enough to decarbonize. So when we have this discussion about innovation, I feel very strongly that it has to be approached with many players, and you have to embrace the competitive players, because many of the innovations we have right now have been driven by competitive companies, entrepreneurs who are trying hard to, drive down costs, bring new technologies. And I really, the theme I would most want to stress from this is that I really encourage utilities to partner with these third parties. We heard some examples of that just previously, but also the regulators. What we're really going to need here is real strong regulatory leadership, so that, and diversification away from this focus on a centralized power generation and long distance transmission system if we're going to meet the climate challenges that we have. Unfortunately, some regulated utilities, and I would say actually many, have viewed on-site home solar as a competitive threat due to the impact on eroding retail sales, versus as an opportunity. And I have some examples that we're going to get to where some utilities and regulators have embraced it as an opportunity. And I feel strongly that it is essential that we get a mind shift there of it not being the problem, but rather, being the opportunity that I believe it is. And because of that, we're seeing pretty dramatic proposals right now to put fixed fees, lower compensation for customers who are making their own personal investments to create generation, clean generation, and storage that really could be and are assets to the grid. So, what we sort of concluded in this paper is that, we really need regulators to work hard to change the utility incentives, to update the rate designs. I think absolutely time varying rates are a very big part of that. We certainly, in California, all solar customers are subject to time varying rates. You don't have the option to opt out if you're a solar customer. And they're very important for shifting load and optimizing when that power and hopefully stored power can be used. And then, really to update it though, so we could support DR adoption and two-way flows of electricity. So what I want to do is we'll go to the next slide, is just give a couple of examples, and then we can certainly talk about it in Q&A as well. If you can go to the next slide. Oh, thank you. So one example is in Vermont, Green Mountain Power. And just for disclosure purposes, the former CEO of Green Mountain Power, Mary Powell, is now the CEO of Sunrun. So I'm very familiar with this, but even before she became the CEO of Sunrun, Green Mountain Power is a B Corp, which I think is also a really interesting element of, or thing to consider when we consider changing incentives for investor-owned utilities, and recognizing that if they're going to be a driver in innovation, we need to acknowledge that they have a commitment to their shareholders. And so how do we manage that and make sure that the commitment to society is also central? Because if not, I don't know that you can really rely on them to be the driver of this innovation, or on any private entity, which is why it is so important to have the consumer advocates, to have the third parties, to have a wider array of voices in these proceedings and to recognize the incentives that are behind all of the players, when they participate. But some of the things that Green Mountain Power did is one was create this solar map, which provided information at circuit level hosting capacity and helped guide developers away from places with grid constraints. And I think that's another important theme here is, access to the data, access to information so that third parties can really be effective partners in meeting the grid needs. They also entered into a multi-year regulation plan, and a number of the papers talk about just the importance of trying to find a way to stabilize rates and maybe decouple the financial interest from electricity sales, and to put some cap on some of the non-power costs. I mean, we know that the way that most cost plus rate of return regulation is set up today, that the incentives are for investor-owned utilities to invest capital, in hard infrastructure. And I have a lot of concerns about that in terms of stranded costs that I think we're all going to be facing, because I know at the same time, we have all these third party competitive companies out there, trying to come up with new ways at the edge of the grid. And so it's just so important that regulators really are leaders in ensuring, while not trying to slow down innovation, to really have an eye on the risk of stranded costs that I think is kind of inherent in the way that utilities are set up to make money right now. But Vermont also had an innovative pilots program, and I did see a question in the chat about regulatory sandbox. We talk a little bit about that in our paper. Connecticut, I think, is also, Chairperson Gillette is really leading on that issue right now, of really trying to look at ways to enable innovation in a quicker way. And in this case, in Vermont, there was a reasonable cap on the amount of money of $5 million. You could do it with a very short notice, and you could get out and try these ideas, and hopefully they are good, but if not, they fail fast and you can move forward. And then the one that's really gotten a lot of attention, was very important to Sunrun, was they were the first utility to embrace the bring your own device program for behind the meter batteries, where they, essentially gave their customers batteries in exchange for the data and the ability to use that power to reduce peak demand, to reduce some of the transmission expense. And the really important development there is they didn't just say, okay, we, the utility, are just going to do this, we're going to own it, but they actually allowed and supported competitive alternatives so that customers would have the choice. And I think that that's really important as we move forward, is to ensure that third-party alternatives have an opportunity, that there is a level playing field, so that you can get that innovation, you can get that competition and drive down costs. Next. The other example that I'm just so excited about is Hawaii. I believe that Commissioner Potter's on one of the advisory committees here. And also, Chair, I have to tip my hat to Chairman Jay Griffith, because what they have just done in Hawaii is such an example that I think everyone should be looking at. And partly it's an example of learning too, regulatory learning. 6 years ago, I would not have said this about Hawaii, because they took a pretty dramatic approach in basically reducing net metering. And it had a quite negative impact on the distributed energy, distributed solar industry. But fast forward a few years, and they're realizing that there's really a need for this resource. There's a need to shut down a coal plant, and the commission acted extremely quickly and effectively in creating a new emergency demand response program, a distributed energy resource tariff that is essentially, encouraging customers to put batteries on with their solar, and providing them money if they will, provide that power during the peak periods when it's so essential to be able to safely close down that plant. But in addition to that, they've embraced performance-based regulation in a way that I think no other state really has yet, and have really, worked hard with all the stakeholders to come up with what those incentives should be, and what the metrics should be. It's a difficult thing to do. I think we've all heard that, but I do think that Hawaii provides a good example, and a good example, as I said, of just regulatory leadership, which is so important to get any of this done. And then they've also undertaken an integrated grid planning docket. So it's, to me, when I look at that and I see There, how you have a commission that was faced with, they're islands, right? And so, very dependent on external sources of fuel to find the way to use their regulatory authority to get the utilities and the third-party providers and the consumer advocates and environmental groups to work together was very impressive. And I suggest people look at that. So next. So some of our recommendations, we tried to look at near-term and longer-term solutions. So obviously, near-term is to try to reduce some of these barriers of innovation, to create these sandboxes, but to make sure you do it in a way that the consumer advocates and the third-party providers can participate, because there's a real resource imbalance. In fact, it's one of the reasons I went to Sunrun after leaving the Maryland Commission, after overseeing cases where the utilities had so many more resources and they could recover them in their rates. There still is an imbalance. So let's make those sandboxes easy for people to participate in. Fostering a DER market. I just truly believe, after my experience here at Sunrun, that there is a lot of value by making a more distributed system in terms of resiliency, in terms of getting investment outside of the rate base, and the ability now to aggregate solar and batteries and EVs. And, we're very excited at Sunrun that we have this partnership with Ford now and their Ford F-150 and the power of the battery that are going to be in people's trucks. We need to find a way to use that resource as we're trying to innovate and improve our grid. And then to really, incentivize those DERs for resilience. We're facing in California right now a real concern, wildfire season again, and also a concern about reliability with, in the coming, summer and year. And I have to say, let's compensate customers, let them be part of the solution. Let's really value that resource and make sure we are using it as we're trying to, let's not just jump to solutions of, going back and keeping over open plants that are really intended to close. And then I think another point that's in the paper, we have a few paragraphs on, is the importance that utilities play in just their regular blocking and tackling, hopefully not blocking, tackling maybe, of service upgrades and interconnection. We have found as more and more customers have wanted access to batteries, we've just had very long delays. Concerns on, questions on interconnection, questions on if we've had to have main panel upgrades. This is the kind of stuff that we need if we're going to have electrification across the country. We need, I'd love EEI and the Institute to really, really embrace how can we do things to get the best practices of interconnections and upgrades across all utilities so that this is not a barrier to customers who want to electrify. And then really important, and we've heard this from the consumer advocates here, and I think from BlueGreen Alliance as well, that transparency and accountability is so important here. Let's share the data. Let's get those, those mapping of the system out so that we can make wise investment decisions and get those resources in. On the longer term, I think one of the things that for some reason didn't make it on my slide is the distribution platform option for utilities, which, is, I think, something really important to consider. And we have a little bit of that in the paper, and I think it's probably worth a whole nother. I know there's a lot of other groups that are looking into that right now, but I think that is a really important part of this, is figuring out the proper role utilities, which I sort of view as the conductor of this amazing symphony of new technologies that are out there. But how do we, figure out where those demarcations are? But some of the other things is, I do think there's good opportunities to share program savings with utilities. We've seen some of this with, when we have had non-wires alternatives. I think New York has tried to do that, and I would really encourage more of that. It can't be the case that we're going to say everything's got to be, the rate of return now plus for innovation. That's not going to drive lower costs. I think what we have to look at is, it may be that the utilities role has got to be a little different if there's multiple other players, and that should be okay. And that's the role of the regulator and legislators to look at that and recognize that with innovation, you are going to have some maybe reduction in size of some utilities and, increase in other players. So I think shared savings is important, but we have to recognize that at the end of the day, this has to be cost effective for customers, or it's not really gonna take off and not gonna be sustainable. And I'm really a fan of performance-based regulation. And that's why I was so excited about looking at what Hawaii did. It's hard. I looked at it when I was a regulator, and I think some people have pointed out the risks of, what if you pick the wrong, the wrong goal? What if you don't have good measurement of it? So it takes work, it takes participation. But at the end of the day, I just don't think that the traditional way that we regulate utilities is going to get us to where we need to do to transform our grid. So anyway, with that, I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That was terrific. And next and last, we have Max McCafferty with Build Edison. And following Max's presentation, we will get to your questions. So stay tuned. Max?
Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Max McCafferty with Build Edison, and myself and my colleagues put together a report focusing around the challenges and opportunities in scaling utility innovation. Next slide, please. So to step back quickly and contextualize, why scaling is such a key and central challenge. First of all, across the country, over a dozen states are legislating aggressive climate and energy goals, and many of these are attached to strict timelines. Simultaneously, energy infrastructure across the country in states like Texas and California is under strain. It's vulnerable to natural disasters and storms, and this strain is only going to increase as we continue to electrify our energy usage, such as heating and transportation, as well as we continue to add renewables, variable renewable energy resources to the grid. And as a result, efficiently scaling innovative clean energy solutions and grid solutions is critical to meeting these goals and to maintaining the reliability of our grid. Next slide, please. Quickly, it's important to touch on the fact that it's unavoidable that the utilities are central in this process of scaling innovation. Third parties have a very important role to play, but ultimately, utilities have access to the physical assets on the grid, as well as unbelievable data on customers, usage, generation, transmission. And fundamentally, they are key in identifying, deploying, and scaling the necessary innovative solutions as a result of this expertise, this access, and these resources. However, in the process of identifying and developing new solutions, scaling has largely been neglected by both utilities and regulators. And the first way that we see that is in innovative solutions, which are sometimes and maybe often trapped in pilot after pilot with no clear path to scale deployment. And secondly, regulators broadly not allowing enough paths to cost recovery for the process and the projects associated with scaling. Next slide, please. So an example of this time of use race, which we've talked about a little bit today, but between 1975 and 2020, there were 4 generations of pilots around time of use rates. It took 43 years and that 4 generations of pilots to achieve only 4% residential customer penetration for time of use rates by 2018. There are similarly very long timelines for grid modernization projects. It takes over a year to, on average, to get a grid modernization project approved. And that process can be as long as 3 years. And it takes the average project 5 to 8 years to complete overall. Next slide, please. And so our report set out to identify some of the key challenges that lead to this difficulty in scaling technologies from demonstration to broad deployment. And one of the first areas that we looked at was outdated incentivization of utilities. And the first thing within that category, we would say, is maybe an outdated conception of failure around pilots and projects. Something that really emerged when we were talking to utility and regulatory experts was that the idea of what is useful from a project needs to evolve. That if a project met a prudent standard and even if it doesn't meet its stated goals upon completion, the learnings that are generated from that project and the ways that the utility can use that project to inform future innovation strategy are still extremely valuable. And so, it constitutes it meets the standards of prudence and used and useful, and there ought to be pathways to recover costs for some of these projects. And secondly, regulators often do not prioritize innovation or long-term outlooks on technology investments. And as a result, there are not enough opportunities for utilities to cost recover around projects associated with it. Second challenge that we looked at was utility culture, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but innovation is often siloed within utilities, and that leads to a host of challenges around scaling technologies from successful pilots to broad deployment. And then finally, incomplete innovation programs. While there are a growing number of opportunities to pilot and demonstrate technologies and a growing number of resources and programs to do so, often these programs end at the completion of a pilot, and there needs to be more consideration for the process and pathways to scale successful solutions once they complete these programs. Next slide, please. And so what are some of the opportunities to address these challenges? Starting with the regulatory side, first around utility incentivization. And I think that the fundamental equation here is that utilities are going to do what they're incentivized to do. And so if regulators, and if people want utilities to take more risk in order to meet these energy and climate goals, in order to improve the reliability and resiliency of the grid, then they need to be incentivized to do so. And so, there are a whole host of different methodologies that are available to do this. We talked about performance-based incentives, earning a higher return on certain investments, being allowed to own and operate certain assets. Different technologies require different solutions. And of course, there always needs to be consideration for current ratepayers, what's affordable, but there need to be more opportunities here. Secondly, an expansion of the conception around key performance indicators. What we found was that often there are most investments in projects are evaluated almost exclusively from the perspective of today. Are they prudent for the grid of today? Are they reliable for the grid of today? And in a climate where, again, we have these rising energy and climate goals, as well as we're undergoing massive shifts in our energy usage, electrifying transportation, electrifying heating. These projects need to be assessed on the basis of the future needs of the grid as well. Next slide, please. Then on the utility side, some of the opportunities. Again, analyzing innovation programs across the country, there are numerous opportunities to pilot and demonstrate technologies, but limited support for scaling successful pilots and demonstrations beyond those programs and up to broad adoption. And so scaling solutions needs to become a core pillar of innovation programs and should be included in planning from the start. The goal of these innovation programs and the goal of pilots more broadly should be to identify solutions which at scale meet energy climate goals for the utility, for customers in general. And as a result, the processes, resources, pathways to scale a successful pilot need to be clearly defined. They need to be rigorously mapped out at the outset of an innovation program, so that when you identify, when you host a successful pilot, the path to scaling that technology more broadly is efficient and quick. And then lastly, a central reason for the gap that we identified was the siloing of innovation within utilities. Innovation teams are often separate within utilities by design. What this leads to, best case scenario, if you have a successful pilot, That means that you're transitioned from an innovation team to a core technical team within the utility, and to some degree you have to start over in terms of your relationship building and in terms of demonstrating the applicability of your solution to the utility and the viability. But worst case scenario, and what sometimes happens is that companies have a successful pilot. They do great work with the innovation team, and then when they're passed on to the core technical team, they find that their technology doesn't really offer a solution to the utility. They find that the innovation team might have not fully accurately represented the needs of that team, or so on, which leads to wasted time, resources, and effort all around. And so utilities can evolve internally to address a lot of these issues by bringing experts, diverse problem solvers to the table who integrate across divisions and departments, and by making innovation a core function of the utility and having it touch more directly on a lot of these departments. Next slide, please. Yeah.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you.
All right, it's time for questions and answers. So I've been collecting your questions. Thanks so much. Let's get started. And again, I'll ask our panelists to try to keep it short so we can get as many perspectives as possible. Let's start with an issue certainly that a couple of you brought up about equity. So how do we keep an equity mindset in mind, especially with energy burden, and trying to keep that as low as possible as utilities spend money on innovation? And then how can we make the benefits of innovation more equitable for energy burden communities? Let's start with Shannon and then Tim, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks. So I'll start, and I'll try to keep it quick. And I think that could have a very, very long answer. I know in Massachusetts, we have been reaching out to a lot of stakeholders, and we've even formed a stakeholder working group to sort of explore equity issues. And what we've heard over and over again is just that there's sort of a lack of recognition of the barriers that people face to participate in these sort of utility decisions, especially when it comes to participating at, in front of the public utility commissions, and also in outreach and making sure that people are really well informed as to what is going on. And we have another thing we've heard over and over again is that outreach really needs to be tailored specifically to different groups, and what might work in one neighborhood is not going to work in another neighborhood. So, we've been really pushing for people to better tailor their outreach and to sort of recognize the barriers that exist out there for people to really participate meaningfully, make their viewpoints known, and for those viewpoints to be really well represented. So I think if people don't understand sort of the repercussions of some of these decisions and aren't able to participate, then those viewpoints just aren't going to be represented. And we do our best as consumer advocates, but we have a lot of competing interests, and we can't always just represent every single interest of every single neighborhood, every single sort of stakeholder out there. So we definitely believe in Massachusetts that people need to be better informed and better able to participate in these kind of decision-making processes.
Thanks, Shannon. Let's go to Tim, and then I'm going to go to Adam.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it brief and just kind of to follow up with what Shannon was saying. I completely agree. I mean, need to get these groups more involved early on. That's a change from how things were, but I have to keep pushing it. I mean, pushing it from a consumer advocate, but even the regulators' perspective too. Every opportunity we get, set up collaboratives wherever we can push for that. I mean, we've seen that here in Iowa where we've pushed the utilities and required collaboratives to open it up and have more transparency. We've heard that from many presenters that transparency is an issue that needs to change. It needs to change now before we get too far behind. So getting the groups involved, getting more people involved, because it can't just be all on the regulators and the stakeholders. There's not enough people, not enough expertise or experience to make sure that the solutions are meeting everybody's needs. So yeah, I completely agree with Shannon that we got to get more groups involved, get them involved now, but also keep pushing those stakeholders, especially utilities that have more of the information, more of the data, as Max even talked about. They're the holders of this great amount of data and great amount of information. Let's get it out of them so we can learn from it and design better products going forward.
Adam, and then Ann.
Yeah, I mean, I love the collaborative idea. It's really about, bringing in groups to co-design solutions that work for them. I think that's a challenge. I think it's a great idea. It's hard to implement. There's bandwidth and resource challenges. There's a steep learning curve for just how this sector is, how it operates, how it's regulated. But if you start to do the collaboratives, bring in participants from groups that you want represented both on the front end in terms of designing something that works for them, and on the delivery, marketing, making certain that those communities, those individuals in your communities are aware of the program. I think that's what we're all trying to drive at. In terms of, let's also remember, we all 3/4 of low-income households use this thing as their primary internet connection. So start thinking about mobile-first approaches. Start thinking about meeting them where they're at, and multiple languages. So I think we have a good, starting point. I go back to, it can be challenging from a resource and bandwidth perspective across all parties, but these, meeting the community, where they meet is important, and electric companies are doing that with a number of third parties. Thanks.
All right, great. Let's go Ann briefly, and then I do want to hit the other panelists too, see if they have thoughts. Ann?
Sure. One of the equity issues that's brought up a lot on distributed solar is, this issue that somehow it's harmful to non-participants. And, I think it's really important to look at what we've seen in the California NEM case is a huge outcry from low-income communities and people who absolutely want to have an alternative. They're the ones that are the most harmed when the power doesn't work. They're the ones who have lived by often the fossil generation that has caused health impacts on them and their families and continues to. And so I think it's really important that we think about how do we expand access to some of these new technologies, because there's a crying need for it for the people that are really the most harmed by our current, the failures in our current system.
Great, let's see if we can get maybe no more than a minute from Chris and then Max.
Yeah, I think it's just important that we recognize that utilities are oftentimes one of the largest taxpayers in communities, one of the largest employers oftentimes as well. And when the shift in the way that we actually operate utilities changes, and that flips where they're not so, that causes a tumultuous set of reactions that come forward. So I think in terms of like innovation and thinking about clean baseload power need, it's really incumbent on utilities to have the ability to and be excited about and incentivized to think about things not just that are going to create that clean baseload power, but are also going to replenish or replace those jobs that are there, and then really do some very intentional thinking about how to crosswalk jobs from where they are today to where they will be in the future.
Max, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I think obviously extremely critical, and I think it's very easy to kind of look at massive multi-billion-dollar wind or solar projects and not give enough consideration towards residential homes and the potential opportunity there to provide demand response or rooftop solar and resources of that type.
Good. Let's get to another question here. We've got a lot, not that much time. So this is about regulatory sandboxes and giving utilities some latitude to be able to experiment within limits, prescribed limits, without having necessarily to come to the Public Utility Commission for permission, to do something. So what's your view on these regulatory sandboxes at a small scale to try to experiment with some of these regulatory utility business model and technological issues? I'm going to start with Adam, then go to Tim and Shannon, and then maybe Ann.
My view is, I like the idea. I think there's a need for it, right? The how to do it, the size of it, the what happens, what's your off ramp. Those things should be, developed and designed. But and there's also where are you doing these the sandbox on the regulatory side, but also the sandbox on the, let's say, the innovation side? Is it on grids, system innovation, customer program innovation? I think there's roles for both. And I think that there's now several states who have had some experience. So are we cross-sharing across states so that we may learn from that? Thank you.
Tim, and then Shannon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends. I mean, I think it's kind of a balance that you have to strike with establishing what could be allowed and what could be then expected to be allowed to be recovered. I mean, so set up the proper benefits metrics that the utility would know that they have to meet when they come forth to get the recovery of that. But I'm all for it if the utility is willing to take on some of the risk. And that's where I think that utilities are going away from. And I understand with these huge investments, it's understandable. But what we're talking about here, I think in this question is more of a smaller scale kind of, lesser dollar impact. If the utility is willing to assume some of the risk until they come in, but then they show the benefit metrics, then I think there's that right balance. But getting the utilities to assume risk is a key.
And do you have thoughts on this in some of the proceedings you've intervened in?
Well, I mean, we touched on it a little bit in the paper. I mentioned, I think, Hawaii and Vermont both did it. I mean, I do think that we want to encourage things to go more quickly, right? And to be able to see what's working. I would say that I like the idea of finding a way, maybe through NARUC, maybe with groups like RAP, to make sure that if you invest the effort and you do these and there's one that works, that we kind of share those learnings, because, doing 50 of these or more across the state, again, it gets to a real resource issue also for the third parties that you really want involved in them. So, that to me seems to be really important, that state regulators work together. And I know they try, and I know NARUC certainly tries to do that, but, envisioning doing these in 50 places, I don't know how many people will really, from, even, consumer advocates and others will have the resources to put into these smaller cases.
Thanks, Anne. I want to get to a question that you sort of raised and about transparency and getting the data out there, right? So we have a question about, a statement first, that there's really no consistent reporting in many cases on outcomes for consumers. And how can we go forward with more innovative technological and regulatory experimentation if we haven't required basic reporting on utility performance in a way that matters to consumer and in a way that allows comparisons across utilities? Let's start with Anne, since you've raised that, but I also want to get to other folks on the panel here.
Well, I guess I was looking at it more, not just at the performance. I think that is critical. Just if you want to have, especially if you're going to start going down and doing these innovative things, you've got to have some, just like, something that shows whether it's working for the consumer. I was really thinking about it in terms of access to information. I found Max's paper really interesting, obviously slightly different conclusion than ours, but part of it I think you were leaning in on was, hey, utilities have all this data, they have all this information. Well, the truth is that should be available to, certainly to the consumer easily to share to third parties, but really to third parties. I mean, you've got groups like Utilidata, all these companies that are starting up that have ideas for ways to really make the grid more efficient. And so I don't think it's in the public interest to have the utilities kind of have, control over this data. Obviously, there are, privacy issues and things that I think can be worked out, but that's really what I was trying to get at, because, you really need to know, private companies need to know where there's, I think, Adam, you had some interesting examples there too, where one of the utilities was using that, was a PG, Portland General. And I think, well, why them only, right? Like, why can't someone else be able to target them with information, with that information? So that's really more my point. I think data is valuable, as we all know, in our society today. And so let's try to leverage it as much as we can.
Max, do you want to respond here quickly?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think, our perspective is much more along the lines of like, utilities currently aren't, or broadly aren't sharing that data. And so what can we do within the system that we currently have? I totally agree. I think that releasing that data provides so much insight to prevent potential technology companies and potential founders and so on to leverage and develop innovative solutions that, the utility doesn't have, maybe the bandwidth to be thinking about or exploring themselves. And so, no, I totally agree.
All right, let's get to Shannon and Tim. I want to get some consumer viewpoints here.
Yeah, we're obviously very supportive of maximum transparency and accountability. We just feel like we're constantly, any stakeholder other than the utilities are always at a bit of a disadvantage, especially when it comes to these sort of innovation type dockets, because nobody knows the utilities systems as well as they do. So without sort of access to certain data and information, it can be very hard to advocate effectively. And obviously we think that customers should also be able to have access to as much information as possible. And just to get really quickly back to what Anne was saying, definitely performance targets and metrics and incentives are super important. I just think that we're not going to get very far without them.
Adam,
I want to give you a chance to jump in here quickly and then get to another.
Yeah, the data thing. So it's it's for me, it's one day one thought, the other day maybe a contradictory thought. So on the customer energy use data, so I think we need to be really clear about what we say by free the data or release the data, because they really have, I think, different applications and need for protection. And ultimately the customer energy usage data it's used for certain reasons by the utility, and it's the customer's usage information. I think, safe, secure, authorized sharing third parties, not really an issue. I don't think that's a big issue. I think when it's more of a system related data share, there's a lot of maps and tools that are built already to support third-party applications and to support their business. This may be controversial, but I don't recall ever a third party saying, let me share my data with you, the utility, on these customers. It's typically a little bit of let me drive that third party's business interest that connects back to servicing the customer and maybe selling their product. So I'm just going to kind of say that it's typically a one-way request, and there's certain needs for protection when that request is made.
So I see a couple of hands up. I want to get to another question. Anne and Tim, if you want to get in really quickly, just make your point quickly.
Go ahead, Anne.
Thanks. One thing in our paper that we pointed out again in Hawaii was they required the utility to share their model, their resolve model. And that is also super important, that these models that utilities have, very expensive consultants put together, have to be, like, for rate cases, for any of this, should be available to the parties in a case, because if not, it's just too expensive and you don't have common baseline. So really urge commissions out there, open up those models and you'll get much better input from everybody.
Okay, Tim?
Yeah, and just kind of even going off of what Anne just said, is the point I was going to make is that the utilities need to realize that transparency, while it seems like the consumer advocates and regulators are bugging the utilities for this, it creates better awareness that when they come in then and ask for these new offerings or recovery of costs, if we've got the transparency ahead of time, we're less reluctant to be against it since we've already understood it. But so many times it's pulling teeth to try to get the information after the fact. Whereas if it had been up front and been kind of building all along, it makes for the regulatory process to go a lot smoother.
All right, I'm going to go in a completely different direction. I have a question for Chris. Chris, have you seen utilities begin to engage with labor to garner community support for infrastructure? And what are the prospects for better engagement between utilities and labor in this regard?
Yeah, they have. And I think there's like two parts to this question, Lisa. I think, first is in the construction of renewables or new assets and the processes that need to go on there, and involving labor in those discussions and especially local forces, are really thinking about timelines and outcomes that are going to be necessary. So that's one piece to it. The second part to it is the folks that actually work for the utility. And so utilities having an ongoing relationship with their workers is actually, I think, generally strained. And there's room for improvement across many utilities. Some have some pretty good dialogue going on here in Colorado. I think we've got a good case example where Xcel Energy has shared and actually done a really remarkable job in thinking about its workforce transition, and then being, to the transparency point, being very transparent not just to regulators and to folks that speak regulatory language, but to workers and to communities overall, and just to general citizens about what they're planning to do and how they're going to achieve those things, and thinking about workforce transition. And that transparency, I think, is actually quite productive. I think a lot of other utilities are in a tough spot where they don't feel like they can actually be open and honest about the issues that they're grappling with. And I think there's definitely room for improvement there.
All right, I want to get to we don't have much time, and I want to get to a couple more questions. What is about sharing information across utilities, across states? Would better dissemination of pilot results be useful? So like not everybody has to do their own pilot. How many pilots do we have to do here? Are there any kind of perverse incentives for everyone doing their own pilots and not using their own results? And, you know, is there a central place that we could kind of store this stuff and share this information? Who'd like to go first?
I can say one thing, Lisa. I think one thing that we should be looking at is, in the West at least, new evolutions in the regional transmission organization sort of discussion, where Nevada, Colorado, both requiring their regulated utilities to join an RTO, and thinking about resource planning across state lines, and sharing that information, you know, both with regulatory commissions, but also with each other, about how they can have achieved mutual benefit through transmission planning together. I think that's an interesting precedent, and that may actually extend and grow.
Max, do you have thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I think it could be extremely valuable. As we touched on, you know, pilots that are successful, obviously that provides a lot of very interesting and compelling data around, you know, what investments should be made. But in addition, pilots which don't work out, projects which don't work out, provide a lot of extremely valuable learnings around directions that may or may not work. And so I think it is very important to build some kind of a system where we can share this data, where, you know, ratepayer dollars, maybe from a more macro perspective, are being utilized more efficiently, and utilities are able to invest in projects with higher likelihood of success overall.
One of our participants wanted to note the NEROC and NASIO, the state energy offices, efforts in this area, and that there's some good information there. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to share, best practices they've seen come out from that effort? If not, I'll invite Rod Sovin to put something in the Q&A box that we can maybe share with others. Kristen, if you can share it. Any thoughts there? I think folks maybe not as familiar about it. You know, I wanted to sort of end with this. We just have time for one more quick question and responses. When we talk about innovation, you know, we talk in the report, a couple of folks have talked about, look, failed pilots are not necessarily failures, right? We're learning something. How do we sort of get out of the cycle that customers are paying for innovation when it works, innovation when it doesn't work? Why don't we get some thoughts on that? Let's start with Tim and Shannon.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of go back to some of my other comments on that. I mean, I think there's a kind of a sharing mechanism that could help benefit that going forward. So many times it's all or nothing. They either get full recovery of it or they don't. Whereas if they start coming forward and, again, as I mentioned, set up some benefit metrics where they're sharing the risk and then the sharing of the rewards afterwards, I think there's a good chance or a good opportunity for us to adjust things going forward to make that more of kind of the way we proceed rather than an all or nothing proposition.
Shannon?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Tim on that. It's just about having really easily understandable information, I think. And again, like going back to transparency, if the utilities are able to kind of prove that there were benefits to these sort of failed ideas, then I think we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to sort of recovery there, but it really needs to be well spelled out, and everybody needs to be able to understand what that looks like and how it's going to be used going forward and how it's going to actually eventually benefit ratepayers.
Adam's thoughts on how we get out of this cycle?
I think it's learning from failure, embracing that as part of the cost of doing business, and delivering better programs, you know, bringing on cleaner energy, you know, addressing reliability. It is a cost of doing business. Every business has that, whether it's a regulated entity or not. And I think just knowing that this business is changing, and to manage the risk of when something does fail.
Well, thanks all of you for your work on the report, your participation today. Thanks everyone for joining us. The slides, the report, and a recording of this webinar are available or will be available on our future electric utility regulation website. I put the link in the chat a few times. Thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.